In the spring of 1887, on a wind-burned shelf of rock above the Gila River in Arizona Territory, a stone tower stood empty and condemned, and a woman of 28 stood at the base of it counting the last coins she owned. The county had listed the structure for $1 at the courthouse steps in Solomonville, the way a county lists a thing it wishes to be rid of. The men who gathered to watch the sale called it the Old Watch, a relic from the years when the road below it had been worth guarding, and they laughed when she raised her hand. They did not know that the tower had a chest in it bolted to the floor of the upper room, and they did not know what the chest held. She did not know either, not yet. She knew only that her father had taught her to read iron, and that a thing locked is a thing somebody meant to keep. Her name was Della Hart, and 3 weeks before that morning she had buried the last of her family and walked out of a house that was no longer hers. There is a kind of poverty that arrives slowly, through a bad season and a worse one, and there is a kind that arrives in an afternoon, when a lawyer reads a paper and the floor you stood on belongs to a bank. Hers had been the second kind. She had $1 folded in a square of oilcloth, a leather satchel, and the tools her father had left her, and when she heard the courthouse crier name the tower and its price, she understood the arithmetic of it at once. $1 was all she had. $1 was all it cost. Watch how a life narrows to a single coin, and then watch what that coin can buy. You may already be thinking that no good ever comes of buying a thing nobody wants. Stay with the story, because the men, laughing on those courthouse steps, were about to be wrong in a way none of them lived long enough to fully understand. Della folded the oilcloth back into her satchel and signed her name in the county book, and the clerk dated the line the 14th of May, and the tower was hers. To understand why a ruined tower mattered to a woman with nothing, you have to understand the man who raised her. Eli Hart had been a locksmith and a safe man before the river country ever saw him, trained in a shop in St. Louis where the work was exact and the customers were rich. He had come west not for gold but for the failure of other men, because a frontier is a place where strong boxes outlive the people who buy them, and somebody has to open the ones whose owners are dead or gone. He fixed bank vaults in 3 territories. He cut new keys for safes whose makers had burned down. And in the evenings, by the light of a single lamp, he taught his daughter the one thing he believed worth teaching, which was patience with iron. He used to say that a lock is not a wall, but a conversation. He said it more than once, in the flat, plain way of a man who did not waste speech, and Della had heard it so often that it had stopped sounding like instruction and started sounding like the truth about the world. A lock is not a wall. It is a question the maker asked, and if you are quiet enough and slow enough, the iron will tell you the answer. She had sat beside him with a file in her hand before she was 10 years old. She had learned the difference between a ward and a lever, between a cheap padlock that yields to a hairpin and a good one that yields only to time. By the time she was 20, she could open most things her father could, and he had told her so, which was the nearest he ever came to saying he loved her. He died in the winter of 1886, of a cough that settled in his chest and would not leave, and the debts came after him the way debts do. The house went, the shop went. The good tools, the heavy bench vise, the drill press, he had freighted in at great cost. All of it went to a man in town who paid 1/3 of its worth, and felt generous doing it. What Della kept was what fit in a satchel: a set of picks rolled in oiled cloth, a small ball-peen hammer with a hickory handle worn pale where his hand had held it, a folding rule, a pair of files, and the knowledge in her own 2 hands, which no creditor could itemize and no auction could sell. That was the inheritance. The world saw a poor orphaned woman with a bag of scrap. Her father would have seen a locksmith, so when the crier named the Watchman's tower, Della did not hear a ruin. She heard a building with a door, and a door meant a lock, and a lock meant her father's voice telling her that iron keeps its promises longer than men do. She walked the 4 miles out from town that same afternoon, the satchel on her hip, and she stood at the base of the tower and looked up at it the way you look at a person you have just been introduced to and already half trust. The tower was older than the territory's statehood and looked it. It rose perhaps 40 feet, 4 square stories of mortared river stone, built in the years when the road below carried payroll wagons up to the mining camps, and a man with a glass could sit in the top room and watch 10 miles of approach. The roof had gone in one corner. Birds had been at the upper windows. The iron door at the base hung true on its hinges still, but it was locked, and the county had no key, and the clerk had said as much with a shrug, as though a locked door were a defect rather than the whole reason she had bought the place. She set her hand flat against the iron and felt the day's heat in it. Then she knelt and looked at the lock. It was a good lock. That was the first surprise. A cheap county building gets a cheap lock, a thing stamped out by the hundred, but this was a heavy mortise mechanism of a quality she had seen only on bank doors, and somebody had paid real money to hang it on a stone shed above a river. Her father had a saying for that, too. He said that the size of the lock tells you the size of the secret. A man does not guard an empty room with a banker's lock. She did not say the words aloud, standing alone in the wind, but she heard them, and she felt the first cold thread of curiosity work its way down her spine. She worked the lock for the better part of 2 hours, kneeling on the stone sill until her knees ached and the light went long and gold across the river canyon. It did not yield the way a common lock yields. It had been built to resist exactly what she was doing, and whoever had set it had oiled it well, so that the works had not rusted shut in the years of neglect. That told her something also a neglected lock seizes. This one had been maintained, at least for a while, by someone who came back. She filed that thought away and kept working, reading the iron with the tips of her picks the way another person reads a letter, and just as the sun touched the far rim of the canyon, she felt the last lever lift and the bolts slide back with a sound like a held breath let go. The door swung in, cold air came out to meet her, the still trapped air of a sealed room, smelling of dust and old iron, and something faintly sweet underneath that she could not name. She did not go in that first night. The light was failing, and she was tired in her arms and her knees, and a careful person does not enter a strange dark room with the last of the day behind her. She slept that night, wrapped in her shawl at the base of the tower. The door opened beside her, and in the morning she went up. The stair was stone, winding inside the wall, and it climbed past 3 empty rooms to a 4th at the top, the watchroom itself, where the windows looked out on every side, and a man could once have seen trouble coming from any direction. It was here that she found the chest. It sat against the north wall, bolted to the floor through iron flanges, a heavy strong box of riveted plate perhaps 3 feet long and 2 deep, of a make she recognized because her father had worked on its brothers. It was the kind of box a mining company used to move payroll, or a bank used to hold what it could not afford to lose, and it was locked. Now, here is where most people, finding a locked chest in a tower they bought for $1, would have taken a bar to it and pried. Della did not. She sat down on the cold floor in front of the chest and looked at it for a long while, the way her father had taught her to look at a thing before touching it, and what she saw made her go still. The lock plate of the chest had been worked before. The screws that held it bore the faint bright scars of a screwdriver used more than once. Somebody had opened this chest, and closed it and opened it again across what must have been years. The dust on the lid was even and undisturbed, which meant the last opening was old. Still, the chest had a history of being visited, and a thing that is visited is a thing that matters to someone living. What she did not yet know was that the someone had been dead for 11 years, and that the reason the chest had stopped being visited was the same reason it had been built. She began to work. It is worth slowing here because the labor was the whole of the next 3 days, and the labor is the story. The chest lock was a lever mechanism of 6 wards, finer than the door below, and it had been made by a maker she knew by the inside of his work, the way you know a hand by its writing. Her father had spoken of him. A German named Brandt, who had a shop in San Francisco in the 60s and made boxes for the assay offices. Boxes that were said to be honest, meaning they could not be opened by trickery, only by the key or by a craftsman with time. Della had no key, she had time, and she had the picks rolled in oiled cloth, and she had her father's patience, which was the rarest tool of the 3. The first day she did nothing but map the lock, she made no attempt to open it. This is the discipline that separates a craftsman from a thief, and it was the first thing her father had ever taught her about a fine mechanism, that you do not lay a hand on it until you know what it is. She seated each pick in turn, and felt for the order of the levers the way you learn the shape of a dark room by touch before you trust your feet. The Brandt lock had 6, and each had its own weight and its own travel, and a good lock is good precisely because the levers do not announce their order. She found the first one easily. The second answered. The third she lost twice and found again, and by the time she had the feel of all 6 in her mind, she had been kneeling so long that her hands had gone stiff in the cold high air, and she had to work them warm before she trusted them further. She kept a small notebook and marked in it what each lever wanted, in a shorthand her father had devised, little marks that meant deep and shallow and slow and quick, a private language between a dead man and his daughter. She drew the lock as she understood it, the way a surveyor draws a country he means to cross. When she had filled 2 pages, she stopped, though the light was still good because mapping is one labor and opening is another, and a craftsman does not let eagerness rush her from the first into the second. She closed the notebook. She wrapped the picks in their oiled cloth. Then she ate a little of the bread she had carried out from town, sitting in the watchroom window with her back against the cold stone and the canyon falling away below her, the river a thread of silver in the last light, the empty road that had once carried the payroll wagons running pale along the far bank. She thought about the man who had sat where she sat, year after year, watching that road. She did not yet know his name. She knew the lock he had hung, though, and a lock is a kind of letter from the man who said it, and she had begun already to read him. She slept again at the base of the tower, the satchel under her head. The men in Solomonville had, they thought of her at all, would have pictured a foolish woman sleeping in a ruin she could not use. They were not thinking of her. They had already forgotten the dollar and the laugh. The second day she began to lift the levers in earnest, and she met the first real setback. The 4th lever would not seat. Something in it had worn, or warped, or been damaged, and where the other 5 answered cleanly, the 4th hung and slipped, and would not hold its lift. A lesser hand would have forced it. Forcing it would have broken the lever and sealed the chest forever, and Della knew this the way she knew her own name, so she stopped, and she sat back on her heels, and she did the hardest thing a craftsman ever does, which is nothing. She waited. She thought about what her father would have done. He would have made a tool for the problem rather than forcing the problem to fit the tool. So she went down to the river that afternoon and found a length of soft iron wire fence that had blown into the rocks, and she cut a piece, and over the little fire she built at the tower's base, she heated it and worked it and filed it, the small hammer rising and falling in her hand. The hickory handle pale, where her father's grip had worn it, and now her own grip wore it deeper, until she had shaped a pick that would reach past the worn lever and lift it from behind. It took her until dark. She did not test it that night. A tool made in tiredness is a tool you mistrust. She slept. The third day the air was clear and cold, and the canyon below was full of birdsong, and Della Hart climbed the stone stair for the last time as a woman who did not know what she had bought. She knelt before the chest. She seated the 5 good levers one by one and held them, and then she slid the new pick into the lock and reached for the 6th, the worn one, the one that had stopped her, and she felt it catch on the shaped tip and rise, slow and grudging, and hold. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the whole mechanism shifted under her hands, all 6 levers aligned at last, and the bolt drew back with a deep iron sound that she felt in her teeth. She lifted the lid. The smell came first, that faint sweetness she had caught at the door 3 days before, stronger now. The smell of old paper and beeswax and something gone to dust. The light from the east window fell across the open chest, and the dust she had stirred hung in the shaft of it, and Della looked down into a thing that had been sealed for 11 years, and for a long moment she did not move at all. The chest was not empty. The men in town had assumed it was, if they had thought of it at all, because an empty box is what $1 buys. The chest was full, though, and not with what she might have hoped. There was no gold in it, no coin, no payroll that would lift a poor woman out of poverty in an afternoon. What lay in the chest was paper. Bundles of it, tied with faded ribbon, layered and pressed and preserved by the dry desert air and the tight iron seal. Ledgers, letters, and on top, wrapped in oilcloth the way her own dollar had been wrapped, a single bound book with a cracked leather cover. She lifted the book out with both hands and opened it on her knees, and she began to read. And as she read, the canyon outside went on with its morning, and the birds went on singing, and the whole arithmetic of her situation began, slowly, to invert. The book was a record. It had been kept by a man named Josiah Crane, who had been the watchman of the tower in the years when the road below carried the payroll of the Calder Mining Company up to the camps at Ramah. Josiah Crane had sat in this room with a glass and watched the road, and he had also, it became clear as she read, watched something else. He had watched the company. He had kept, in his small exact hand, a second set of figures alongside the ones the company filed, and the 2 sets did not agree. The company reported what it paid its men. Josiah Crane recorded what it actually paid them, and the difference, multiplied across hundreds of miners and a dozen years, was a theft of a size that took Della some time to believe. She read all that day. She read past the point where her eyes burned. Persang, the Calder Mining Company, which still operated, which had a fine office in Solomonville and a finer one in Tucson, had for years paid its miners in company, scrip redeemable only at the company store, and had recorded those payments in its own books as cash wages at full value and had billed the territory and its investors accordingly. The scrip was worth a fraction of its face. The men took it because they had no choice, signed for full wages they never received, and the company kept the difference and called it profit. Josiah Crane, sitting in his stone tower with nothing to do but watch, had seen the wagons go up full and come down emptied of nothing, and being an honest man with a head for figures, he had begun to keep count. What she did not yet understand was why a watchman's private accounting had been sealed in a banker's chest behind a banker's lock, or why Josiah Crane had stopped writing in the winter of 1876, or why no one had come for the chest in all the years since. The answers were in the letters, and she read those next, and they were harder. The letters were to Josiah Crane's daughter. He had written them and never sent them, which is a thing a careful man does when he is afraid that sending a letter will get someone killed. They told the story plainly, without self-pity, in the voice of a man setting down a true account because the truth deserved to survive him. He had taken his figures to the company. He had believed, being an honest man, that honest men ran the company and would want to know. He had been wrong. He had been told, courteously, by a man named Harlan Calder, that he was mistaken, and that a watchman who could not count should perhaps not be a watchman. And then the threats had come, not in words a court could use, but in the small frontier ways, a dead dog at the door, a fire in the brush below the tower, a rifle ball through the watchroom window one night that missed his head by the width of a hand. Josiah Crane had understood that he was a man who knew too much and had no power, and that the only thing he could do with the truth was preserve it and wait for a day when someone with the will to use it might come. So he had bought the chest. He had bought it with his own savings, a banker's chest with a brant lock, the finest seal a poor man could afford, and he had bolted it to the floor of the room where he kept his watch, and he had sealed his ledgers and his unsent letters inside it. And then, in the winter of 1876, Josiah Crane had died. The letters did not say how. The final entry in the ledger was dated and unfinished. Della understood, reading it, that he had not expected to finish it. The company had let the tower fall into ruin because a ruin draws no eyes, and the county had eventually taken it for unpaid assessment, and it had sat for 11 years with the truth bolted inside it, waiting until a locksmith's orphaned daughter laid down $1 because it was the only dollar she had. Here is the moment to stop and ask what you would have done. Della Hart sat in that cold, high room with proof in her lap of a theft that had bled hundreds of working men across a dozen years. And she was poor, and she was alone, and she owed the world nothing. She could have closed the chest. She could have walked away. She could even, and this is the darker thought, have sold her silence to the Calder Mining Company for more money than she had ever seen. The chest had made other men rich by keeping it shut. It could have made her rich the same way. She did not consider it for long. Her father had taught her that a lock is a promise, and that the man who builds it and the man who keeps it are bound by the same word. Josiah Crane had locked the truth away not to hide it, but to save it, and the lock had held the promise across 11 years and waited for a hand that could read it. Della Hart had read it. The promise was hers now. That was not a thing she reasoned her way to. It was a thing she simply knew, the way she knew iron. She also knew the difference between truth and proof. She had read enough of her father's work to understand that a ledger alone is one man's word against a company's, and that Harlan Calder, who was still alive and still rich, would call Josiah Crane a madman, and the books a forgery, and that a poor woman who lived in a ruined tower would be an easy thing to dismiss. She needed the truth to be undeniable. She needed it tied to the world in a way no lawyer could cut. And the way to do that, she understood, was not to accuse but to verify, to take Josiah Crane's hidden figures and lay them beside the records that still existed, until the difference between them stood up on its own and spoke. She went down the mountain the next morning, but not to Solomonville, where the Calder office was. She went the other way 8 miles along the old payroll road to the camp at Ramah, which the company had abandoned when the ore played out, and which now held a few stubborn families who had stayed because they had nowhere else to be. The road was a hard walk, climbing and falling along the canyon wall, and she carried only her satchel and a canteen and the copies she had begun to make, because she would not carry the originals where they might be lost. The camp, when she reached it, was half tumbled down, the company buildings stripped of anything worth carrying, the store with its windows gone and its shelves bare, a few houses still holding smoke at their chimneys against all the reasons not to. She was looking for someone old enough to remember, and she found him in the second house she tried, an old miner named Tomas Reyes, who had worked the Calder claims for 19 years and had the bent back and the burned lungs to prove it. He sat in the doorway of his house in the morning sun, mending a harness he no longer had a horse to use, and he watched her come up the road with the flat patience of a man who has learned that strangers bring trouble more often than they bring anything else. He was suspicious of her at first, as a man who has been cheated learns to be suspicious of everyone, and he asked her plainly what a young woman wanted with old company business that was better left buried. She did not soften it for him. She told him the truth, standing in his yard with the harness in his lap and his eyes on her face. She told him about the tower and the chest and the watchman who had counted what the company paid, and she watched the old man's face change as she spoke, watched the suspicion give way slowly to something he had not let himself feel in years, which was the possibility of being believed. He set the harness down. He asked her to say the watchman's name again, and she said it, Josiah Crane. And the old man nodded slowly, because he had known the name, had seen the man once or twice in the old days, a thin, quiet figure in the high window of the tower they all passed beneath on the wagon road. He had known. Of course he had known. Every man in that camp had known he was being robbed, had felt it in the gap between the wage he signed for and the scrip he could spend. But knowing a thing and being able to prove it are different countries, and Tomas Reyes had lived his whole life in the first one. He told her, in the flat, unhurried way of an old man with nothing left to lose, how it had worked. A man signed the book for $30 a month. A man received scrip stamped with the company name, good only at the company store, and the store charged $1.50 for what cost 50 cents in town, so that the $30 a man signed for was, in truth, $10 he could use, and the difference vanished into a ledger he was never shown. When Della told him there was a record, kept in an honest hand, sealed for 11 years and now open, the old man put his face in his hands, and he did not weep, but he came near it, and when he took his hands away, his eyes were wet and his voice was rough. He told her he had a box of the old scripts still, kept out of bitterness, because a man does not like to throw away the proof of his own robbing, even when the proof is worthless. He went into the house and brought it out, a cigar box soft with handling, and he opened it and showed her the chits, the company paper stamped and dated, dollars that had never been dollars. She held one to the light. Alone it was nothing, a worthless old token. Laid against Josiah Crane's ledger, though, it would be a nail. And she told him so, and she saw the old man understand for the first time that the thing he had kept out of bitterness might become a thing he had kept out of foresight. He became her ally, and more than that, he became her memory of the camp. He knew which families were owed and how much. He knew the names. He remembered the company paymaster, a soft-handed man named Lund, who had counted out the scrip with a smile, and he remembered the store and its marked prices, and his memory, laid beside Josiah Crane's figures, made the figures live. 2 old men, one dead and one nearly so, had between them kept the whole truth, and now a third hand had come to bring the 2 halves together. Over the next weeks, Della worked harder than she had ever worked at any lock. She copied Josiah Crane's ledgers in her own clear hand, twice so that no single fire or theft could end the truth, and the copying alone took her many days, sitting in the watchroom from the first light to the last, her hand cramping around the pen, the river going about its slow business below her. She walked from house to house in the dying camp with Tomas Reyes beside her, and the old man's word, where her own would have meant nothing, opened the doors. He vouched for her at each threshold, told them in the old tongue and the new what she carried and what it meant, and one by one the stubborn families brought out what they had kept. She gathered from the old miners the scraps they had hoarded, the scrip itself, kept by some out of bitterness, the wage slips a few careful men had saved against a day they never quite believed would come, the company store accounts that showed the marked prices in the storekeeper's own hand. A widow named Serna brought out her dead husband's signing book every month of his wage marked and witnessed, and the figure in it matched Josiah Crane's record of what the company claimed to have paid, and stood against the scrip that was all he ever held. Each scrap alone was nothing, a handful of company paper, a worthless old chit, a faded slip, laid against the ledger, though each one was a nail, and the nails together built a thing that would hold weight. This is the patient arithmetic of justice, that it is not built in a single blow, but assembled, piece by recovered piece, until the structure stands on its own and no one can pull it down. She kept a list of the families and what each was owed, figured from Josiah Crane's count, and checked against what the old men remembered, and the list grew until it ran to 4 pages, and the sum at the bottom of it was a number she had to write twice to believe. She did the work the way her father had taught her to do any work, slowly, exactly, trusting the small, true steps to carry her to a large, true end. She did not hurry. Hurry was the one thing the company had counted on, all those years, the hope that the men it robbed would be too tired and too scattered and too poor to ever assemble what had been done to them. Della Hart was poor, and she was alone, but she was not too tired, and she had a dead man's count to build upon, and she was not scattered. She was, if anything, the most gathered person in the territory. She did not go to Harlan Calder. She never once confronted him, never sent him a letter, never gave him the chance to prepare a defense or buy a silence or arrange an accident on a lonely road. This was deliberate, and it was her father's teaching applied to people instead of iron. You do not announce to a lock that you intend to open it. You simply, quietly, do the work and present the open door. So Della worked in silence, and when she had assembled the whole of it, the ledgers and the copies and the gathered scraps and the sworn memory of a dozen old men, she did not take it to the company or to the county, both of which the Calder money had touched. She took it east by the slow mail and by a trusted hand to a newspaper in Tucson whose editor had no love for the mining trusts, and to a federal mineral lands agent whose office the company did not own, because the territory it had defrauded was federal land, and the lie it had told about its wages was a lie it had also told the government. What happened then happened without Della Hart in the room, which is how she wanted it. The agent came west and saw the evidence and understood at once what he was holding, because the difference between the two sets of figures was not a matter of interpretation, but of arithmetic, and arithmetic does not take a side. The newspaper printed the story across its front page, the Watchman's Tower, and the sealed chest and the 11-year-old account of a theft, and the story was reprinted in San Francisco and in Denver, and at last in the Eastern papers where the company's investors read it over their breakfast. The Calder Mining Company did not survive the season. Its stock fell to nothing when the investors understood that the profits they had been paid were stolen wages, and that the courts were coming. Harlan Calder, who had threatened an honest watchman 11 years before and had slept easy every night since, found that the foundation he had built his whole life upon was not stone but paper, and paper had been the one material he should have feared. He was not shot. He was not hunted down or confronted on any street. Della never saw his face. He was simply, over the course of a few months, undone by the weight of what had been buried, his company dissolved, his name made a thing that respectable men did not wish to be associated with, his fortune drawn down into the lawyers and the judgments. He left the territory before the worst of it. Where he went, Della did not know and did not care to learn. A man who builds his life on a lie is a man standing on a trap door, and all the truth has to do is find the latch. The money came back slowly, the way money does when it has to pass through courts. It did not all come back, and what came was less than what was taken, and some of the men who were owed had died waiting, and their share went to their children or to no one. Yet it came. Thomas Reyes lived to see his own share paid, $1,100 for 19 years of shorted wages, and he used it to fix the roof of his house and to buy a headstone for his wife, who had been buried under a wooden marker because there had never been money for stone. The dying camp at Rama did not come back to life because the ore was truly gone, but the families in it were made whole as far as the law could make them, and they knew at last that they had not been fools or weaklings, but men robbed by a stronger hand, and there is a dignity in that knowledge that money cannot buy and cannot replace. Della Hart took nothing for herself from the judgments. This surprised the agent, and it surprised the newspaper, and when they pressed her she said only that the chest had not been hers to profit from, that she had bought a tower and a lock, and the right to open them, and that what she had found inside belonged to the men it had been stolen from. She was offered a reward by the federal office, a finder's portion, and she declined it, and the declining was not pride but something simpler. She had been raised by a man who fixed other people's locks for a wage and never once kept what was behind them. She did not know how to be a different kind of person and did not wish to learn. What she kept was the tower. The county, somewhat embarrassed to have sold for $1 the building that brought down its largest company, would have taken it back and given her better. But she did not want better. She wanted the stone tower above the river, the 4 square rooms and the winding stair, the watchroom at the top where Josiah Crane had kept his honest count. She repaired the roof where it had gone. She glazed the broken windows. She set her father's small hammer on the sill of the east window where the morning light came in, and she made the watchroom her workshop, and a locksmith sign of her own hung at last from the iron door at the base. The door she had opened with 2 hours, and her father's patience. The men in Solomonville stopped laughing. They did not apologize because men of that kind rarely do, but they came around in the slow way that doubt comes around when it has been proven wrong. And within a year, the same county that had sold her a ruin was sending her its locks to mend, its safes to open, its strong boxes whose keys had been lost or whose owners had died. She was the best in the territory, and they knew it now. And they had known it all along without knowing they knew it, because the proof of what she could do had been bolted to a tower floor the whole time, waiting for the right hand. She kept Josiah Crane's ledgers. She did not give them up to the court when the case was done. She had made copies enough that the truth was safe 12 times over, and the originals she kept in the chest where they had waited 11 years. The chest she left bolted to the watchroom floor, open now, its lid raised, no longer a seal but a kind of monument. Sometimes a child from one of the river families would climb the 4 miles to see the tower that had broken the company, and Della would let them up the winding stair, and she would show them the chest, and she would tell them, in few words, that an honest man had once sat in this room and counted, and that his counting had outlived him and the men who wished him dead. She would tell them the thing her father had told her in the plain way he had said it, that a lock is not a wall but a conversation, and that the iron keeps its promises longer than men do. And the child would look at the open chest and the morning light and the small worn hammer on the sill, and would not fully understand, the way the young do not understand the weight of patience until they have spent some of their own. They would remember the tower, though. They would remember the woman who bought it for $1 when the whole town laughed, and who found inside it not gold but something that turned out to be worth far more, which was the truth, kept safe by a lock until a hand came that could read it. Years later, when Della Hart was an old woman, and the best locksmith the territory had ever known, with apprentices of her own and a reputation that reached to the coast, she was asked once by a young man who wanted to learn the trade what the most important tool in her satchel was. He expected her to name a pick or the fine files or some clever instrument of her own design. She thought about it for a moment, sitting in the watchroom with the river below and the morning coming in the east window, and she reached out and laid her hand on the small ball-peen hammer with the hickory handle, worn pale by 2 generations of grip. She said that the most important tool was the one you do not use. She said that any fool could break a lock, and that the whole of the craft and most of the worth of a life lay in knowing when to wait. The young man did not understand her, not then. He kept the saying, though, the way she had kept her father's, and the way Josiah Crane's count had been kept, and that is how the true things move down the years hand to hand, from the ones who learned them the hard way to the ones who have not learned them yet. The hammer stayed on the sill. The chest stayed open. And the morning light came up the canyon every day and fell across the watchroom the way it had fallen the morning she lifted the lid when a woman with $1 to her name discovered that the thing the whole world had thrown away was never empty at all.